Maggie Collins sat on the edge of her living room couch, her body rigid, her hands locked together so tightly her fingers ached. The house was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if sound itself had learned to avoid the place. Just days earlier, laughter and small footsteps had filled these rooms. Now there was nothing, only the weight of absence pressing down on her chest until breathing felt like work. The accident had been sudden, a routine drive, a stretch of road they had taken dozens of times before, and yet, in one irreversible moment, her husband Thomas and their 6-year-old daughter Lily were gone. The police officer's voice had been calm, practiced, almost gentle. The words themselves had not been. Maggie barely remembered hanging up the phone. What she remembered was the moment afterward, how the world seemed to tilt as if reality itself had slipped out of alignment. Since then, one thought had taken root and refused to let go. They had argued before the trip. Not a small disagreement, not the kind that faded with time, but a sharp, bitter exchange that left words hanging in the air, unsaid apologies trapped behind pride. Maggie replayed it endlessly, every sentence, every tone, every look. If she had stayed quiet, if she had gone with them, if she had stopped Thomas at the door, in her mind the conclusion was always the same. They would still be alive. Dr. Susan Hale stood a few feet away, watching her friend with quiet alarm. Susan had known Maggie for years, not as a patient, but as a woman who had once been steady, thoughtful, anchored by her family. What she saw now was someone hollowed out from the inside. Maggie spoke little, and when she did, her voice carried no inflection, as if emotion itself had burned out. "I don't want to hear that it wasn't my fault," Maggie said flatly when Susan tried, gently, to intervene. "It doesn't matter what anyone says. I sent them out the door like that. I killed them." Susan shook her head, her professional calm giving way to something more personal. "Maggie, you didn't cause the accident. You argued. Couples argue. That doesn't make you responsible for everything." Maggie cut in. Her eyes were dry, too dry. "They're in the ground, Susan, and I'm still here. That doesn't feel right." The words landed heavily between them. Susan realized with a tightening in her chest that Maggie wasn't simply grieving. She was preparing to disappear. She tried reason. She tried comfort. She tried silence. Nothing reached her. Maggie spoke of her life as if it were already over, as if she were merely waiting for the body to catch up to the decision her mind had made. Finally, Susan did something she had never planned to do. Something reckless, born not from protocol, but from desperation. "If you truly believe you took 2 lives," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then give life back." Maggie looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Become a surrogate," Susan said. "Carry a child for someone who can't. Give a family what you believe you destroyed." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Maggie stared at her as if she hadn't heard correctly. The idea felt wrong, almost cruel, as if Susan were asking her to trade one unbearable pain for another. "That's insane," Maggie said quietly. "You're asking me to bring a child into the world when I don't even want to be in it." Susan didn't argue. She didn't justify herself. She simply said, "I'm asking you to stay." Maggie turned away, shaken. But long after Susan left, the words remained. For the first time since the accident, something unfamiliar stirred beneath the guilt and grief. Not hope, not yet, but a question. And that question refused to let her sleep. Maggie sat on the couch long after Susan had gone, the room dim except for the weak afternoon light slipping through the curtains. The family photo album lay open on her lap. She hadn't meant to open it. Her hands had done it on their own, as if memory were stronger than will. Page after page, the past stared back at her, smiles frozen in time, moments that now felt almost unreal. Her fingers stopped on a photograph from just weeks earlier. Thomas had his arm around her shoulders. Lily perched between them, grinning at the camera with a missing front tooth. Maggie's throat tightened. Slowly the present faded, and the memory she had been trying so hard to avoid pulled her under. It had been their wedding anniversary. 7 years. The kind of number that should have felt solid, earned. Maggie remembered standing in the fitting room of a small boutique, smoothing the fabric of the dress she had finally allowed herself to buy. It wasn't practical. It wasn't something you could cook dinner in or chase a child around the house wearing. That was exactly why she loved it. For the first time in years, she wanted to feel like a woman again, not just someone's wife or someone's mother. They had reserved a table at a restaurant Thomas had been talking about for months. A quiet place, dim lights, real conversation. Maggie had asked Thomas's mother weeks in advance if she could watch Lily for the evening. Everything had been planned carefully, deliberately, as if the night itself were something fragile that might break if handled carelessly. The phone call came in the afternoon. Thomas's mother sounded embarrassed, apologetic. She had bent down awkwardly the day before and felt something go wrong in her back. That morning she could barely stand. She wouldn't be able to make it over. Maggie listened in silence, her fingers gripping the phone until her knuckles turned white. She understood. Of course she did. But understanding didn't stop the disappointment from crashing through her all at once. When Thomas came home early from work, Lily trailing behind him, Maggie was already on the verge of tears. She told him about the call, about the canceled plans, about the dress still hanging in the closet with nowhere to go. Thomas sighed and sat down, not even taking off his jacket. "We can go see Mom," he said. "Make sure she's okay. Pick up anything she needs. We'll celebrate another time." The words were reasonable, calm, and somehow unbearable. Maggie felt something sharp rise up inside her, something she didn't recognize until it was already speaking for her. She snapped back, accusing him of never choosing them, of always putting everyone else first. Thomas's patience thinned. His voice hardened. They went back and forth, each sentence landing heavier than the last. When Maggie said the words about his mother, words she knew even as she spoke them were unfair, there was a moment of stunned silence. Thomas looked at her as if he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. "Enough," he said finally. Lily, sensing the tension, tugged at his hand and asked if she could go with him. Maggie didn't stop them. She couldn't. She stood frozen as Thomas took their daughter and walked out the door, the disappointment in his eyes worse than any raised voice. An hour later, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Thomas. Maggie barely remembered the rest. The words blurred together. Accident. Emergency responders. She remembered dropping the phone. Remembered sinking to the floor. Remembered screaming until her voice gave out. The memory dissolved, leaving her slumped on the couch, the photo album still open in her hands. Exhaustion finally overtook her. Maggie curled in on herself, clutching the album to her chest, and fell into a shallow, restless sleep, surrounded by the ghosts of a day that had shattered everything. That night, Maggie dreamed. In the dream, she was standing somewhere vast and quiet, a place without walls or sky. The air felt weightless. 2 white doves descended slowly and landed on her outstretched hands. Their feathers were warm, alive beneath her fingers. She was afraid to move, afraid even to breathe, as if the smallest motion might send them away. Then, without warning, one of the doves began to glow. Light spilled from its body, soft at first, then brighter, until the shape itself dissolved into shimmering dust. The light drifted upward and vanished, leaving her left hand empty. The second dove remained. Maggie felt its weight change. The warmth grew heavier, more human. She looked down and saw that the bird was no longer a bird at all, but a newborn child, small and fragile, curled against her palm. Panic surged through her. The baby shifted, and Maggie struggled to hold on, terrified she would drop it. Her hands trembled as she tried to keep the tiny body from slipping away. She woke with a sharp intake of breath. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her arms were wrapped tightly around the family photo album, pressed against her chest. Her hands tingled, aching faintly, as if they had truly been holding something with weight and warmth. Maggie sat up slowly, her heart racing, the image of the baby still vivid in her mind. It was just a dream, she told herself, but the feeling refused to fade. Over the next few days, the dream followed her everywhere. She replayed it while standing in the shower, while staring out the window, while lying awake at night listening to the quiet house. She tried to dismiss it as grief, as her mind searching desperately for meaning. Yet something about it felt different, persistent, almost deliberate. For the first time since the accident, her thoughts began to shift, not away from guilt, but around it. What if staying alive didn't mean forgetting? What if it meant carrying something forward instead of disappearing? Susan's words returned to her uninvited. Give life back. Maggie resisted the idea at first. It felt dangerous, heavy with responsibility. But slowly the resistance weakened. The thought of carrying a child, of feeling life grow instead of decay, began to feel less like punishment and more like an anchor. 3 days later, Maggie picked up her phone. Susan answered on the second ring. Maggie didn't bother with small talk. Her voice was steady, calmer than it had been in weeks. I'll do it, she said. I'll become a surrogate. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a careful exhale. Susan didn't ask why. She already knew. She explained the process, gently, step by step. Medical screenings, legal contracts, clear boundaries, everything handled properly, safely, and transparently. Maggie listened, absorbing the information without fear. She wasn't doing this for money. She wasn't doing it to replace what she had lost. She was doing it because, for the first time since that phone call, she had a reason to wake up the next morning. Robert Hale had always imagined his life filled with noise. He grew up in a house where silence rarely lasted more than a few minutes, doors opening and closing, voices overlapping, children running through hallways with little regard for personal space. His parents worked hard, but they were present. Dinner was loud. Holidays were crowded. Even arguments ended with everyone still sitting at the same table. For Robert, family had never been an abstract idea. It was something tangible, something warm and constant. That vision followed him into adulthood. When he married Catherine, he believed it was only a matter of time before that same kind of life took shape around them. Catherine, however, had imagined something very different. She loved their home precisely because it was quiet, clean lines, order, control. She took care of herself meticulously. Early mornings at the gym, careful attention to what she ate, regular appointments that ensured nothing was left to chance. Her appearance mattered to her, not out of vanity alone, but because it was something she could manage completely. Her body, her schedule, her future, those were hers. Pregnancy had never fit into that picture. Whenever Robert brought up children, Catherine responded with practiced ease. Not now. Maybe later. Let's enjoy what we have. At first, Robert accepted these answers. He told himself that timing mattered, that patience was part of love. But as years passed, the conversations grew heavier, returning again and again without resolution. The cracks in their marriage were not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors. Instead, there was distance. Catherine changing the subject too quickly. Robert lingering too long at family gatherings, watching his nieces and nephews with a look he didn't try to hide. His mother noticed. She asked quiet questions. Catherine smiled through them all. The truth was simple. Catherine did not want to be a mother. Not the pregnancy. Not the sacrifice. Not the loss of control. One evening, after yet another carefully restrained conversation, Catherine surprised him. We could use a surrogate, she said, as if suggesting a new appliance. Robert looked at her, unsure he had heard correctly. A surrogate? Yes, Catherine replied calmly. Plenty of couples do it. It's legal. Efficient. We get a child without turning our lives upside down. She spoke in facts, not feelings. There was no mention of longing or connection. Just logistics. Robert hesitated. The idea unsettled him. In his mind, family was something shared from the beginning, pregnancy included. He had imagined Catherine carrying their child, imagined seeing her body change, imagined the closeness that would come from that shared vulnerability. But Catherine was firm. I'm not doing it myself, she said plainly. This is the only option I'm willing to consider. For days, Robert wrestled with the decision. He knew this was not the family life he had envisioned. Yet, he also knew that walking away would mean giving up entirely on the dream he had carried for so long. He told himself that love took many forms, that a child was what mattered most, not how they arrived. In the end, hope outweighed doubt. He agreed, not because he believed surrogacy would fix everything, but because it was the last path left that might turn their marriage into the family he had always wanted. The meeting took place in a quiet office that felt deliberately neutral, as if emotion had been designed out of the room. Soft gray walls, a polished table, folders stacked neatly in front of each chair. Maggie sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening more than speaking as Susan guided the conversation. This was the formal introduction, not as a friend, not as a grieving widow, but as a surrogate. Susan explained Maggie's background in measured, professional terms, careful to keep personal details to a minimum. Robert listened closely, nodding along, his attention fixed on every word. Catherine leaned back in her chair, arms crossed loosely, her expression composed and unreadable. The lawyer reviewed the contract line by line. One child. That point was made clear from the beginning. Compensation was outlined in exact figures, along with monthly support for medical needs and living expenses during the pregnancy. There were clauses covering medical risks, unforeseen complications, and procedures in the event of emergencies. Parental rights were addressed carefully, leaving no ambiguity once the child was born. Maggie absorbed it all quietly. She wasn't thinking about the money. The numbers felt abstract, disconnected from the reason she was there. What mattered was the structure, the clarity. It gave shape to something she had agreed to emotionally, but not yet fully understood in practical terms. Catherine interrupted only once. I won't be attending appointments, she said flatly. I trust the reports. Video updates are sufficient. Susan acknowledged the request without surprise. That can be arranged. Catherine continued, her tone cool and efficient. I don't have time to sit in waiting rooms. As long as I'm kept informed, that's enough. Maggie glanced at Robert. He looked slightly uncomfortable, but said nothing. Catherine's gaze shifted to Maggie then, quick and assessing. She took in Maggie's appearance, her posture, her face, the quiet composure that hadn't fully erased her natural grace. Something tightened in Catherine's expression before it smoothed out again. She didn't like it. The idea of her husband being around another woman, even in this context, unsettled her more than she expected. Not out of jealousy, she told herself, but control. She preferred distance, structure, boundaries that kept everything firmly in place. The paperwork was signed. Consent was given. The agreement became official. A few days later, Maggie returned to the clinic alone. Susan met her there, guiding her through the final steps with calm reassurance. The embryo transfer was brief, clinical, almost anticlimactic. Maggie lay still afterward, staring at the ceiling, feeling as if something momentous had occurred without fanfare. The waiting was harder. Days stretched on, quiet and heavy. Maggie moved carefully through them, as if any sudden action might disrupt what was happening inside her body. When Susan finally called with the results, Her voice carried a warmth that broke through Maggie's restraint. The transfer had been successful. Maggie was pregnant. She left the clinic that afternoon with her hand resting instinctively against her abdomen, even though there was nothing yet to feel. The city moved around her as usual, cars passing, people hurrying by, but everything seemed sharper, more fragile. For the first time since the accident, Maggie wasn't just surviving. She was carrying something precious, and she knew, with a certainty that both steadied and frightened her, that whatever grew inside her now would change everything. The examination room was dim, the lights lowered to make the screen easier to see. Maggie lay still on the narrow bed, her hands resting on her stomach, her breath shallow and careful. She had been here before, years ago, carrying Lily. The familiarity unsettled her more than she expected. Susan stood beside the monitor, moving the ultrasound probe slowly, methodically. At first, everything seemed routine. The steady hum of the machine filled the room. Maggie watched Susan's face, searching for reassurance. Then Susan stopped. Her hand froze mid-motion. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned closer to the screen, studying it with an intensity that made Maggie's chest tighten. "Susan," Maggie asked quietly, "what is it?" Susan didn't answer right away. She adjusted the angle, then adjusted it again. The silence stretched, heavy and unnerving. "Maggie," Susan said finally, choosing her words with care, "I need you to stay calm." A cold wave washed over Maggie. "Just tell me." Susan straightened, exhaling slowly. "Both embryos implanted." The words didn't register at first. "Both?" Maggie repeated. "Yes," Susan said. "You're carrying twins." The room seemed to tilt. Maggie stared at the ceiling, her mind scrambling to catch up. Twins. 2 heartbeats. 2 lives forming inside her. The image from her dream flashed unbidden through her thoughts. The 2 doves, one dissolving, one remaining. "But the contract," Maggie whispered. "It's for 1 child." Susan nodded. "I know." The reality settled in all at once, pressing down on Maggie's chest until it was hard to breathe. Fear surged, followed immediately by something else, something dangerous and unexpected. Hope. Her thoughts raced ahead of reason. The agreement, the signatures, the limits drawn so carefully on paper. And yet, inside her body, reality had already moved beyond them. 1 child would go to the intended parents. That was clear. But the other, the thought took shape before Maggie could stop it. If she kept 1 baby, she wouldn't be breaking the agreement entirely. She would still give them what they wanted. And in return, she would have a reason to stay. A reason that was living, breathing, undeniable. "Maggie," Susan said gently, watching the conflict play across her face. "We need to think this through." Maggie swallowed. "Can you tell what they are?" Susan hesitated, then nodded. "It's early, but I'm fairly certain. 1 boy, 1 girl." Maggie closed her eyes. Catherine's voice echoed in her memory. Her preference, stated casually but firmly. "A daughter." "If they want a girl," Maggie said slowly, "they can have the girl." Susan stiffened. "Maggie! And I keep the boy," Maggie continued, her voice steadier now. "I'm not taking anything from them. I'm giving them exactly what they asked for." Susan looked at her in disbelief. "That's not how this works. This isn't a technicality. This is—" "I know what it is," Maggie said, tears finally slipping free. "It's the only thing keeping me here." Silence filled the room again. Susan turned back to the screen, her professional instincts battling with her conscience. She knew the rules. She knew the risks, legal, ethical, personal. And yet she also saw the woman in front of her, clinging to the first thread of meaning she had found since losing everything. Finally, Susan spoke. Susan didn't answer right away. She stared at the monitor for a long moment, then finally turned to Maggie. "No one else can know." "Not yet," she said quietly. We'll keep the second heartbeat out of the standard reports for now. Maggie looked up, startled. Can we even do that? Susan hesitated. Temporarily, yes. I'll manage how the ultrasound data is summarized, but this isn't a long-term solution. Eventually it will come out, during delivery or earlier. You need to be prepared for that. Maggie nodded slowly, her throat tight. I just need time. Then we keep it between us, Susan said more softly this time. But Maggie, this isn't without risk. I know, Maggie whispered, but it's the only thing keeping me here. Neither had Maggie, but as she lay there, feeling the weight of 2 lives growing within her, she knew the choice had already been made. The video calls became routine. Maggie sat in the same chair each time, laptop balanced carefully on the table in front of her, hands folded just out of view. Susan joined most calls briefly at the beginning, confirming that everything was progressing as expected, then stepped away to let the intended parents speak with the surrogate directly. Everything looks normal, Maggie said during the first call, her voice even. The pregnancy is healthy. Catherine nodded once, her expression composed. That's good, she said. Please make sure the reports are sent on time. Robert leaned closer to the screen. How are you feeling? He asked. Any nausea? Fatigue? Maggie answered honestly, though selectively. She spoke of mild discomfort, of rest, of routine checkups. She did not speak of 2 heartbeats. She did not speak of the quiet moments at night when she lay awake, counting breaths that were not her own. Catherine remained politely distant throughout. She listened, asked practical questions about schedules and timelines, and then excused herself with reminders about meetings she needed to attend. Her involvement never extended beyond what was necessary. Maggie noticed how Catherine's gaze occasionally flicked toward Robert when he asked too many questions, how her posture stiffened whenever the conversation lingered. Robert, in contrast, seemed grateful for every detail. He asked about appointments, about nutrition, about whether Maggie needed anything. His concern was gentle, almost tentative, as if he were afraid of overstepping. After each call ended, Maggie sat quietly for a moment, letting the screen go dark. Only then did she allow herself to breathe fully. The monthly support payments arrived on schedule. Maggie used them carefully, methodically. Groceries first, prenatal vitamins, comfortable clothing as her body began to change. And slowly, without ceremony, she began setting aside small things for the baby boy she planned to keep. A soft blanket, tiny socks, nothing extravagant, just proof that she was preparing for a future that included him. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Susan monitored everything closely, maintaining the separate records with meticulous care. Maggie attended appointments on schedule, followed instructions, and did everything she was told. Physically, she felt strong. Emotionally, she felt something more complicated. Her bond with both babies deepened as the weeks passed. She spoke to them in the quiet of the evenings, resting her hands against her stomach. She told herself that love did not have to be divided evenly to be real. One child would go to the parents who had longed for her. The other would stay with the woman who had almost given up on living. Still, as the due date crept closer, anxiety settled in. Maggie found herself rehearsing the birth in her mind. What would happen? What could go wrong? What questions might be asked? The truth she was hiding pressed heavier each day, no longer abstract, but imminent. She knew that once labor began, control would slip from her hands. 2 futures were growing inside her, and soon she would have to let one of them go. The first contraction caught Maggie by surprise. She was standing in the checkout line of a small neighborhood store, a carton of milk balanced against her hip, when sharp pain sliced through her abdomen. It wasn't the dull pressure she had grown used to over the past weeks. This was different, sudden, blinding, impossible to ignore. Maggie inhaled sharply and gripped the edge of the counter, willing herself to stay upright. Another wave followed almost immediately. Someone asked if she was all right. Maggie tried to answer, but the words dissolved as she bent forward, her free hand instinctively pressing against her stomach. Within moments, the store manager was calling for help, his voice tight with urgency. An ambulance arrived quickly, the siren cutting through the ordinary afternoon as if the world itself had shifted into emergency. As the paramedics guided her onto the stretcher, Maggie forced herself to speak. "Dr. Susan Hale," she said breathlessly. "Tell them to take me to her hospital." Susan received the call before Maggie even reached the ambulance doors. She didn't hesitate. Orders were given. Rooms prepared. The staff already knew what was coming before Maggie was wheeled through the entrance. Labor progressed fast. The delivery room blurred into flashes of light and sound. Gloved hands, clipped voices, the steady commands Susan gave as she took control. Maggie clung to the edges of the bed, her body doing what it had to do, while her mind struggled to keep pace. Pain narrowed her focus until there was nothing else. The girl was born first. For a split second, Maggie waited for the cry. It didn't come. Susan's expression changed instantly. "Cord," she said sharply. "We have a double wrap." The room erupted into movement. The baby was lifted away, small and frighteningly still, her skin already turning dusky. Maggie tried to sit up, panic slicing through her exhaustion, but hands pressed her gently back down. "Stay with me," Susan said firmly, though her eyes never left the child. Resuscitation began immediately. Oxygen, careful movements. Seconds stretched unbearably long as Maggie watched from the bed, helpless. Finally, a faint sound broke through the tension. A weak, strained cry that filled the room with sudden relief. "She's breathing," Susan said. "Barely, but she's breathing." There was no time to process it. Another contraction tore through Maggie's body, stronger than the last. The second birth came fast, almost urgent, as if the baby itself were pushing forward with purpose. Moments later, the boy was born, loud and strong, his cry cutting cleanly through the room. Maggie barely had time to see him before he was placed briefly against her chest. His warmth grounded her, even as tears blurred her vision. Then he was taken away. 2 routine checks, necessary procedures. By the time Robert and Catherine arrived at the hospital, Maggie was already being moved into recovery. Susan met them in the hallway. Her face was pale, drawn more by emotional strain than physical exhaustion. "You have a daughter," she said carefully. "There were complications during delivery, umbilical cord issues. She required immediate resuscitation." Robert's face drained of color. "Is she alive?" "Yes," Susan said, "but she'll need to remain in neonatal care for now." Catherine exhaled, a strange mix of tension and relief flickering across her expression. "I see." They were not told about the boy. Maggie lay alone in the recovery room, her body trembling with aftershocks of pain and fatigue. Her arms felt empty, her heart pulled in 2 directions at once. One child fighting for breath in another room. One child alive and strong. She closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her temples. The hardest part, she realized, wasn't the pain. It was knowing that everything had already changed, and that the truth was now closer than ever to the surface. The call came in the early hours of the morning. Robert had not slept. He had been pacing the apartment, checking his phone every few minutes, replaying Susan's words again and again. Complications, neonatal care, stable for now. When the hospital number finally appeared on the screen, his hands began to shake before he even answered. The doctor's voice was steady, professional, unmistakably careful. There had been a sudden deterioration. No warning signs, no gradual decline. The baby girl had stopped breathing in her sleep. The medical team had acted immediately, following every protocol, but the outcome had not changed. The preliminary diagnosis was sudden infant death syndrome. Robert sank into a chair, the room spinning. He asked the same questions over and over, as if repetition might bend reality. How could this happen? She was being monitored. She had survived the birth. Was there something they missed? Something that should have been done differently? At the hospital, he demanded answers in person. Susan met him outside the unit, her face drawn, her voice quiet. She explained what she could. Some losses, she said gently, had no clear cause. No one to blame. No mistake to correct. Robert nodded. But the words did nothing to ease the weight pressing on his chest. Catherine arrived later. She listened as the doctor spoke, her expression composed, her posture straight. When the explanation ended, she exhaled slowly and pressed her lips together. There were no tears, no questions, just a faint tightening around her eyes that passed almost as quickly as it appeared. Well, she said after a moment, her voice low, that's unfortunate. Robert stared at her. Unfortunate, he repeated. Catherine shrugged lightly. These things happen. They warned us about risks. Something broke then. Not loudly. Not all at once. But enough. On the drive home, the silence between them stretched thin. Finally, Catherine spoke again, almost thoughtfully. She admitted what she had never said out loud, that she hadn't been ready for a child, that the thought of caring for someone fragile and dependent terrified her. She said it might be for the best, that perhaps this loss had spared them a life neither of them truly wanted. Robert pulled the car over. The confrontation that followed was raw and unfiltered. He asked her how she could speak that way about their daughter. Catherine answered honestly without apology. She said she had never wanted motherhood, not even this version of it. She had agreed only to keep their marriage intact. There was nothing left to argue. By the end of the week, Robert moved out. While their marriage unraveled, Maggie remained in the hospital, moving through her own private aftermath. Susan brought the paperwork to her room, quietly, explaining what needed to be signed. The transfer of parental rights for the baby girl. The documentation that made the loss official. Maggie signed without hesitation. Her hands were steady, her heart anything, but later that day, Susan returned with a different set of papers, custody affidavits, emergency guardianship filings, and a request for post-birth parentage reassignment. Since Robert and Catherine never claimed parental rights over the second child, Susan explained, we can petition the court to grant you full custody. I've already contacted a family law attorney to start the process. Maggie signed every page with trembling hands. It wasn't just paperwork. It was permission to keep breathing, to keep going. By the end of the week, she received a temporary custody letter. A few weeks later, the court order arrived. She named him Andrew. Time moved forward in small, unremarkable steps after that. Maggie took Andrew home. She learned his rhythms, his cries, the way he curled his fingers around hers when he slept. She lived simply, quietly, filling her days with feedings, doctor visits, and long walks that helped her breathe again. Yet grief never left her entirely. It lingered in the spaces between moments, in the empty room down the hall, in the memories of what had been lost, in the knowledge of what had been hidden. Maggie carried it all as she raised her son, not as punishment, but as part of the life she had chosen to keep. 1 year later, the cemetery was quiet. Maggie walked slowly along the narrow path, Andrew resting against her shoulder, his small hand gripping the collar of her coat. He had just learned to walk, unsteady but determined, and now watched the world with solemn curiosity. The air was cool, the sky pale and still, as if the day itself understood where they were. She stopped first at the shared grave of Thomas and Lily. The headstone was simple, just their names and dates carved into smooth stone. Maggie knelt, adjusting the flowers she had brought, and closed her eyes. There were no speeches left to make, no apologies that hadn't already been whispered 1,000 times. She simply stayed there for a moment, grounding herself in the quiet, feeling Andrew's weight against her chest. Then she stood and turned toward another grave nearby. The baby girl's marker was smaller, more modest, her name engraved beneath a pair of dates that barely stretched across a single season. Maggie approached slowly, her steps careful, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. She lowered herself again, setting the flowers down with steady hands. "I'm sorry," she murmured, not expecting forgiveness, only needing to say the words. "Margaret." The sound of her name startled her. Maggie turned, instinctively pulling Andrew closer. Robert stood a few feet away, holding a small stuffed animal and a single bouquet. He looked thinner than she remembered, older somehow, as if grief had reshaped him from the inside out. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said quietly. "I come here sometimes." Maggie nodded, unsure what to say. Robert's gaze shifted to Andrew. He watched the boy carefully, his expression changing in subtle stages. Confusion, recognition, then something like understanding, settling slowly into place. He looked back at Maggie, his voice barely above a whisper. "He looks like me." Maggie felt the moment arrive, heavy and unavoidable. She didn't deny it. She didn't delay. She told him everything. About the twins, about the contract, about the woman she had been when she agreed to become a surrogate. Broken, empty, convinced she had nothing left to offer the world. She told him how she had chosen to give him a daughter and keep a son, not out of greed, but out of desperation to keep living. Robert listened without interrupting. When she finished, he exhaled slowly and nodded. "I left Catherine," he said, "after the funeral. I realized I had been holding on to an idea of family she never wanted." He looked at Andrew again, his eyes softening. "I didn't know I still had a chance." They didn't make promises. They didn't define anything. They walked out of the cemetery together, Andrew between them. The past still present, but no longer unbearable. Some losses never make sense. Some choices exist in moral gray spaces without clear answers. But life, Maggie realized, has a way of returning, quietly, unexpectedly, when there is still room for it. And now, we invite you to reflect. What would you have done in Maggie's place? Where do you draw the line between survival and sacrifice? Share your thoughts in the comments.